Howdy, my name is Chris McBrien, and I will be presenting a summary of my qualitative research study for this semester regarding first-generation experiences in living learning communities influencing retention. Through this presentation, I will be discussing the purpose of the qualitative research study, the research design and process, the data collection process, the methods chosen for the data analysis, and the findings from the study. First-generation students are a growing majority population within higher education, with 56% of the students self-identifying that neither parent has completed a bachelor's degree. Even as college access for this population grows, the student population has not reached the same levels of success and retention as their non-first-generation peers. First-generation students typically face additional challenges in their education due to lower amounts of engagement and campus involvement, which can impact student success, sense of belonging, and retention. The purpose of the qualitative research study is to gain understanding from third-year first-generation students on their perception of support received through a population-specialized living learning community. Through a narrative inquiry, the researcher will empower the two first-generation students to share their stories through a single one-on-one interview. These interviews will provide insight into the students' lived experiences and stories from their first year. There were two research questions guiding the qualitative study of first-generation student retention. These two central questions are research question number 1, how do first-generation students experience success as a result of participating in learning communities? And research question number 2, how do first-generation students' experiences in a living learning community influence their retention? The study will seek to address the primary research questions and purpose through a qualitative study utilizing a narrative inquiry approach to understand the student's perspective and interpretation of their lived experiences and retention as first-generation students. Through a qualitative research study with a narrative approach, the researcher allows the participants to tell their stories. The research study will use the narrative inquiry approach to give a voice and attention to the experiences and views of first-generation students. The narrative approach to the qualitative study will help guide the process throughout the study in the questions asked, the number of participants, and the interpretation of the findings. Using this qualitative approach, the researcher will conduct interviews with two first-generation students who lived in a living learning community their first year. Each student participated in one 30-minute scheduled interview through the Zoom video conferencing platform. In addition, the researcher will review program documents of the first-generation living learning community during the first college year. The narrative approach to the research study will allow the reader to understand the life cycle of the first-generation college students, including what they experienced before, during, and after their first year of college. Considering the research questions and population, the social constructivism paradigm is selected to guide the study. The paradigm provided a foundation and world lens for the qualitative research study to be conducted. As the research questions seek to gather insight, perspective, and experiences from first-generation students regarding their retention and living learning community support programs, the social constructivist paradigm will allow researcher to understand the students' world perspective and experiences, which had led to their decisions of retention. Through using the social constructivist paradigm, the researcher will have the opportunity to interpret the voice and meaning of the world the first-generation students live within. These interpretations can provide deeper insight from the student's perspective as to the reasons behind their retention and success at the university. Research of first-generation students' experiences with involvements in a living learning community, the two similar theories of Vincent Tinto's student departure and Alexander Austin's student involvement theories will be used to provide a framework for the qualitative research study. In the late 1970s, Tinto developed the student departure theory to explain why students leave an institution before earning their degree. In comparison, Austin developed his theory of student involvement to illustrate student behavior within the university. Tinto elaborated on the suicide theory to create a formula for student departure from the campus to consider the student background, academic engagement, social integration, and their commitments. The theory of student involvement places the burden to connect within the classroom and social environments of the campus on the students instead of the institutional level. Like the concepts of a living learning community, the theories developed by both Austin in 1984 and Tinto in 1975 allowed for a student's campus involvement to be holistically reviewed to include their connections and belonging both in the social environments as well as within the academic setting. The theory of involvement and departure creates an opportunity for a qualitative narrative research study to explore a deeper understanding of the experiences first-generation students have during their first year in college. The research questions guide the theories of student involvement and departure, provides the opportunity for stories of the student experiences to be shared through their involvements in higher education. The theoretical frameworks will determine the data collection, research design, and interview questions of the study. The credibility of the study ensures the researcher has interpreted and represented the participants' stories accurately. To increase the credibility of the narrative findings, the researcher utilized the strategy of member checking. Member checking allowed the researcher to check the evidence with the participants to ensure the researcher correctly represented their stories. The transferability of a research study refers to the study's ability to be generalized and applied to other cases. In creating an opportunity for the research study to be generalized, the researcher provided descriptions of the environment and the participants, which will allow future researchers to replicate the project. The tenet of dependability provides the readers with insight into the logic and process of the research study. The researcher for this current study will implement an audit trail of the materials from the research study. The audit trail explanations throughout the findings and data analysis with the raw documents provided within the appendices. Confirmability in the qualitative research eliminates the researcher's bias. The strategies to be used for confirmability will be triangulation and an audit trail. The researcher will provide an outline of the raw documents in the appendices of the paper to provide auditors access to analyze the process and decisions which were made throughout the research study. To triangulate the study, the researcher will use different sources of information such as interviews, observations, and document analysis to confirm themes and insights into the data collected. The qualitative research study took place in a small residential institution in South Central United States, which specializes in STEM majors. The site enrolls approximately 1,500 undergraduate students, with 29% of the population identifying as first-generation students. The criterion for the sample population included that students must be in their third year enrolled at the institution of the study, identify as a first-generation student, have participated in a first-generation population-specific living learning community during their first year in college. Using this sample criteria, the outreach sample size for the site was 12 students. From the 12 students initially contacted for the participation in the research study, 3 students tentatively agreed to participate in an interview to share their experiences of being a first-generation student and part of a living learning community. 2 of the 3 students were available for an interview. The interviews were scheduled via Zoom in 30-minute time blocks, which were selected by participants. The researcher asked the 2 participants 12 questions to guide the discussion about their experiences as first-generation students in college. The interview questions were composed to create an opportunity for the students to tell and explain their stories throughout the interviews. The questions were designed to elicit the participants to share their involvements on campus, support received, and their motivations to continue their enrollment at the university following their first year. Data analysis began with the creation of a transcript of the 2 interviews conducted through Zoom. The researcher utilized the dictate feature on Microsoft Word to upload the audio files. The researcher then reviewed the transcripts for process errors and cultural words or phrases important to the student interviews. The pseudonyms were represented in the data were selected by the students interviewed. The data analysis process was divided into a 2-round coding cycle to distill the information from the transcripts to tell the story of first-generation interviewees. To assist the coding process, the researcher utilized Microsoft Word and Excel. During the first coding cycle, the researcher directly analyzed the interview transcripts for the data using the in vivo method. The codes were selected directly from the words and phrases the participants expressed during their interviews. As the inquiry method is narrative, a social constructive paradigm was used. The in vivo method of coding enabled the researcher to use the direct words from the participants to conduct the initial coding. To code the data using the in vivo method, the researcher imported the interview transcripts into a 2-column Microsoft Word document. In the left-hand column, the researcher included the interview transcript. Then the researcher was able to analyze line by line the left-hand column into the right-hand column to create a code from the participants' words for each line. To align the coding cycle with the central research questions, the researcher selected the focused coding method for the second coding cycle. The focused coding method allowed the researcher to identify the themes and patterns within the analyzed data. In this method, the researcher created a Microsoft Excel document with the in vivo codes collected during the first coding rounds. The researcher sorted the in vivo codes alphabetically, analyzing the columns for patterns within the data. The researcher utilized multiple highlighter colors to indicate similar clusters. Once a pattern of the codes in a second cycle of data analysis emerged, the researcher minimized the number of overall codes reported to the main theme. Since the codes during the interviews were similar between the two participants, using the focused coding method, the themes were narrowed into one category: connections and community. The common theme and results gathered through the interviews provided deeper insight into the two central research questions: student success and influence on retention after participation in a living learning community. Common phrases used by the participants to represent community and connections included bond, unified, connects, not feeling alone, and other phrases that you see on the screen. Through their discussion about the living learning communities, the students saw a connection between their continued enrollment at the university and their relationship with their peers, faculty, staff, and the communities they built early within their college experience, leading into future college years. The first limitation of the study was its size and its location. The research was performed on a small university campus where the student participants knew the researcher already. Since the students already knew the researcher, this could have influenced the results and comfort during the interview. Additionally, another limitation to the research study was the interviews were conducted through Zoom video conferencing instead of in person. The participants referenced in-person connections throughout the interview, but the interview environment was not conducive to the students' comfort. One of the participants experienced unstable internet connections during the interview, which created a challenge in them sharing their story fluidly and leading to the interview being shorter than scheduled. This limited the data available from the students and their opportunity to share their story. Through conducting one-on-one interviews with first-generation students in their third year at a small residential university, the narrative inquiry method revealed themes of connection and community influences for retention following the participants' first year. Guided by the two central research questions regarding success and retention as a result of participation in a living learning community, the interviews aligned with previous literature revealing the experiences first-generation students attribute to their success and retention is related to their campus involvement and community connection. Here are a list of the references used throughout the qualitative research study. Thank you for listening,